So we'll kick off then. Welcome, everybody. My name's Oliver Dodd. I'm one of the co-directors at the CSSGJ, the Centre for the Study of Social and Global Justice. And we're very pleased to welcome you today to one of our seminar talks, which we've been hosting over the spring 2022 semester. Today, I'm very pleased to welcome Parvathi Kumaraswami, who's a professor of Latin American Studies and the director of the Centre for Research on Cuba and the Cuba Research Forum at the University of Nottingham. She completed a PhD in 2004 on women's testimonial writing from the Cuban Revolution, which included a reader's response study. Her research interests lie in the forms, functions, and uses of literature in the post-59 period of Cuba. She has previously published extensively in the area of Cuban cultural studies, including with Antoni Capsia, literary culture in Cuba, revolution, nation building, and the book published by Manchester University Press in 2012, and her single co-authored book, The Social Life of Literature in Revolutionary Cuba, Narrative, Identity and Well-Being, published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2016. She was the principal investigator for a 5-year Leverhulme Trust research progress based in Granma Province, Cuba, about culture, identity, nationhood and globalization in the Cuban periphery. She is currently writing a monograph on the project's research findings, as well as developing research impact work there, a cultural historical tour of the region, La Cuba Profunda. I'm very pleased to introduce Par today. The title of today's talk is The Uses of Culture in Contemporary Cuba. The talk will last approximately 45 minutes, and then we'll continue with about 45 minutes for a Q&A. Par, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ollie. Can you hear me? Okay.
That's great.
Excellent. Yeah. Right. So I've also got a PowerPoint, but I'm not going to, bore you to death with the PowerPoint. And apologies for my cat, who will make his presence felt at some point. So yes, thank you for that introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's a real pleasure, and it's going to be nice to speak to some familiar faces and some less familiar faces. I have been for the last couple of years the director of the Centre for Research on Cuba. Mostly virtually, but we are doing as much as we can to try and keep an active events program, and that includes using online platforms in order to include as many Cubans in the conversation about their own country. It's one of the things that I'll come back to in the course of my talk. So I work in cultural studies, and I don't want to scare anybody off. This is not going to be about textual analysis, literary analysis, all of those things, because my way of getting at culture in Cuba, my way of getting at literature in Cuba, is to see it more in context, to see how it works in Cuba rather than the properties of text. So I'll just get that particular elephant out of the room. What you can see on the first slide here is an image that might be familiar to some of you, actually. This is La Cabaña, the fortress in Havana, in the Bay, which is where the International Book Festival is held every year. It was cancelled last year for obvious reasons. It's being held now in April in Havana, and you can get a sense from this picture, but probably not, only from this one, of the kind of the features of the feria that make it a massive event. It's an event for the people of Havana, and then it travels across the island. It's an event for the people of Cuba. So it'll give you an inkling of how literature, the book, have a very different footprint, we might say, in Cuba compared to many other countries. Those of you who might have been to the Hay-on-Wye Festival or the Edinburgh Festival, the Literary Festival, it's a very different phenomenon. And I'm going to be looking at some of the reasons why it's different in terms of cultural policy. So let me make a start. Just as an overview, I'm not going to read through it because you're going to get a sense of it as I go through. I'm going to be giving you some idea of what the orthodoxy is in terms of approaches to Cuba. And when I say orthodoxy, I mean approaches from outside the island. And then a little bit of a summary of my own work in terms of finding approaches that I find more satisfying in order to understand Cuban culture since 1959. And it's quite a difficult conversation to have with the orthodoxy, because there are some quite conservative lines of thought in terms of approaches to Cuban literature, especially. I'm going to give you a snapshot of Cuban cultural policy, but I want to talk predominantly about what's been happening in the last couple of years in Cuba and its impact on culture. And I'm going to be very honest and say it's been quite hard for me to do much research in the last couple of years, not only because of the pandemic and our own circumstances, but it's been very hard to look at what's happened to Cuba in the last 2 years because of the combined effects of all kinds of crises. And I'm going to be looking at that concept of crisis as a really important driver in the way that Cuban culture has had to develop, not necessarily in a way that respects its own program of social justice and national sovereignty. So I'm going to bring in the actor in all of this that isn't talked about very often in terms of culture, and that's the US. Okay, that's where I'm going to be heading with this talk. So let's get started. The point of it is to try, for me in my work, to pick up what I've been observing over the last 2 years quite painfully, nothing like as painfully as for the Cuban people, but to try and observe that and find a way of incorporating into how I understand Cuban culture in the 21st century, but also how we can look back historically and see what have been the forces that have shaped it. So when I say the uses of culture, I'm being slightly tongue-in-cheek. Of course, I'm not going to categorize the ways that we use culture because they are myriad and they are infinite and they're very, very complex. I will, however, pay homage to the power of culture. I think cultural studies is often sidelined or oversimplified in work that's done in international relations, for example, about cultural diplomacy or soft power. Culture is an extremely powerful instrument for changing minds. And if you change minds, you can change many other things. So in terms of the orthodoxy that I was talking about at the beginning, the orthodoxy outside Cuba, and it covers, 60 plus years since 1959. Cuban commentators often refer to it as a kind of Egyptology. They just go back to certain times way back in the 1960s and use those metaphors and moments to characterize the entire revolution. But the orthodoxy outside Cuba focuses very much on Cuba having developed a siege mentality. The word for blockade in Cuba is bloqueo. They refer to the embargo as the bloqueo. And many people refer to Cubans' mentality, the kind of official mentality of state institutions and their actors, as a kind of a self-blockade. In other words, they haven't been able to get past that very defensive mentality that's been developed. There are some quite clumsy attempts to understand Cuban culture in terms of it being predominantly about moral coercion. So using narratives, using the symbols, the metaphors that come out of culture in order to coerce people into behaving in very homogenous ways. Of course, Cuban culture is often described predominantly, if not purely, in terms of its value as political propaganda. Of course, and we've seen this in the last couple of years, you will have read this in the mainstream media, Cuban culture is often characterized in terms of its the state's desire to repress free art and free culture. It's often referred to predominantly from Florida in terms of cultural underdevelopment. It's referred to in terms of being didactic, that sort of fits in with a moral coercive argument. And of course, it's always related to the shadow of Stalin, the shadow of the Stalinization and the Sovietization of culture, which happened for a period, we might say, but maybe we wouldn't be too categorical about it in the 1970s. The orthodoxy inside Cuba is entirely different. These are conversations that don't overlap very much. And I guess it's quite hard then to have one foot inside and one foot outside and try and build those bridges. So the orthodoxy inside Cuba is that culture is predominantly part of a project of national sovereignty and nation building after centuries of colonialism and neocolonialism in the first half of the 20th century under the US. That culture is for development, that a cultured society is a developed society, and often that has shades of modernity in development, that culture is a bulwark or a defense against colonialism, against imperialism, that culture is a hugely important instrument in a project, the Cuban Revolution, which is all about social justice, egalitarianism, and the freedom to think, to critically engage with the reality that surrounds us. So you can see these are almost kind of diametrically opposed models for Cuban culture, and it is quite difficult, as I've said, to try and negotiate them. Just a little bit, apologies to those of you who know quite a lot about Cuban culture, or even a little bit about Cuban culture. One of the other things that we have to say about Cuban culture and the Cuban Revolution since 1959 is that it is characterized by nearly constant change. And many scholars who attempt to describe areas of Cuban life, whether it's culture or the economy, will often take the route of periodization. I'm not entirely keen on that because I don't necessarily think it's a linear process, but for these purposes, at least, it helps us to understand how the Cuban Revolution has developed and in what context it's developed since 1959. So in terms of the first couple of years, they're often characterized as this idea of anything goes, of euphoria and the kind of mad and hasty accelerated creation of core institutions as part of this nation building project, which then turns into a more sustained project from 61 to 71 of nation building through the redistribution of wealth, through massification of access to services, and through a democratization project, ensuring that all Cubans have access to health, education. You know that story at least probably fairly well. From 71 to 89, a period of economic stability, mostly provided by the political alliance with the USSR and the Eastern Bloc. Those cultural institutions consolidated and therefore creating a golden age. But at the beginning of that golden age, certainly a period known as the Quinquenio Gris, the Grey 5 years, where the Soviet influence or the kind of Eastern Bloc influence was more visible than usual. I would argue, and I have argued in my work, that it's not just about the Soviet Union, it was also about underdevelopment and third world discourses of resistance to the global north more than anything else. But it is in the kind of, the typical periodization seen as the period when the USSR had greatest influence. And then, of course, with the end of the USSR and all of that comes the special period. So this is the greatest change, special period coined by the Cuban government at the time as the special period in times of peace, which is Cuba plunging into a massive economic crisis, which means mass emigration, very rapidly growing inequality, and the clear inability of the state to provide for its citizens as it has done up until 1989. And tourism coming out as the fast track response and the fast track answer to that. But also what we see in terms of culture is local cultures being sustained by local actors, not by the state, but by local actors. More change. So by the early 2000s and the economic recovery that's been brought through tourism, which of course, as we know, creates its own inequalities, the campaign led by Fidel, or the brainchild of Fidel Castro, the Battle of Ideas, which goes back really to the 1960s, that euphoric utopian idea that we can continue to build or rebuild a nation and especially integrate youth through culture and education. But this time, learning from the experience of the 1990s and the localism that developed organically by taking a municipal focus. So the municipalization of higher education, for example. A controversial and sometimes much ridiculed campaign in the 2000s. Again, 2006 to the present, Fidel has passed over, or rather, Raul Castro has been elected, and Raul Castro, with his own and his administration's own approach, which is to update, to modernize socialism, and I'll come to this, to start a rapprochement with the US, after many years of the embargo. So 1962, the US embargo comes in and it covers that entire period and it's still in place today. And in 2019, the end of the historic generation. So Raul Castro steps down and Miguel Díaz-Canel is elected as the head of the government. So there we are, rapid change since 1959, and change which, if we look at 2020 onwards, change which has only been exacerbated since then. Just to give you a sense, and it is just a snapshot, there are some really unique aspects of Cuban cultural policy. Unique aspects, but unique, but also building on models from other parts of the world, not only socialist. So, for example, you can see the importance of culture to the Cuban Revolution by the creation of the Film Institute in March 1959, 3 months after the so-called triumph of the revolution. The literacy campaign, another one of the really kind of seminal campaigns, which reduces illiteracy, according to UNESCO stats, from 23% to 2% in the space of around a year, and engages mobilized youth in that campaign. And then from then on, the creation of national institutions, as I said earlier, which are important to Cuban cultural production, but probably more importantly to universal cultural participation. And the creation, for example, of a publishing infrastructure. So at the same time that this is happening on a national basis, there are many, many signs of Cuban collaboration, cultural collaboration in the developing world, a kind of a cultural internationalism. And then the nationwide network in the 1970s is really kind of solidified and made more homogenized, I guess, in a sense, perhaps more centralized in the 1970s, with every municipality across the island having a set of spaces for culture, a theater, an orchestra, a cinema, a library, a bookshop, etc. Every single municipality across the island has one of those, and they do to this day. Okay, so trying to address the centrality of Havana, trying to create a nationwide system where everybody can participate. And I'm really stressing participation because it's one of the things that's least emphasized in the orthodoxy about Cuban culture. That continues, of course, and is kind of ramped up with the Battle of Ideas in the 2000s, where education and culture are seen as the only really valuable exit from an economic crisis. So the famous quote from Fidel in the 1990s is, the first thing that we have to save is culture. This is in the midst of a really vast economic crisis. And from the 2000s, and we can see it if we visit Cuba today, there's an increasing localization of cultural decision-making, which has its pros and its cons. So these are quite unique policies. They are kind of amendments of the policies that were first created in the 1960s, but they've created a very unique scenario and environment for Cuban culture. And you can see, for a developing country, sorry, apologies to those who are colorblind, but you can see the figure of 2% on that little sliver, which is estimated as the Cuban government spending on culture. If you add that, for example, to all of the other social services, and in a sense, culture is seen more as a social service as any kind of industry. You can see education at 15%, you can see public health and social welfare at 17%, and you can see education at 15%, public health at 17%, and social security at 13%. So you can see that the priorities of the Cuban government to this day are in social spending, and that includes culture. You might look at that 2% and think, it's a little bit unimpressive, but then you can look at the total general government expenditure on recreation, culture, and religion in the EU. You can see a gap also in that line, and we all know what should go in that gap that's no longer there. But here's the EU, and you can see that most countries, the vast majority of countries that have this very broad understanding of recreation, culture, and religion aren't way above 2%. This is predominantly first world countries, certainly Northern Hemisphere countries. Okay, so in terms of a regional profile, we all know about Cuba's successes in health and education, but in terms of culture as well, it invests heavily in culture for some of the reasons that I've been talking about. And these are the things that I've been looking at in my research to date. So a more complex understanding of culture. Ollie at the start sort of, summarized my research, and one of the first areas that I went into after my PhD, along with Tony Capture, was to look at the different regimes of value of culture, so that literature, and specifically or literary culture, can have political, economic, aesthetic, social, commercial value. It's not enough just to talk about literature in a vacuum. So at any given time, a book or the activity of literature can hold a whole series of values. Taking obviously from Bourdieu, taking from Apadurai, taking from John Froh, in terms of trying to broaden an understanding of how culture works in life. My other work has been to look at cultural policy, and I developed an idea of the twin track of cultural policy since 1959. So some of the things that we were just looking at. that culture as an elite activity or a very specialist activity could be seen as a symbol of prestige and modernity that was comparable with other parts of the world. It would sort of fast track Cuba's development profile, but also culture. The other track of the cultural policy was to encourage culture as a democratizing practice. And I hate to put those words there, but it is really a great example of leveling up, allowing access, universal access, in order to allow egalitarian practices of cultural participation, but with local differences. So it's a very interesting thing, and I think we have a lot to learn from how they've done it, obviously with that sustained investment. And then I moved on to think about cultural participation as a source of well-being for people, because it's not enough to talk about the aesthetic or the, I guess, imaginative or genre-based values of literature. We also need to think about how it works in society. So culture and literary culture and reading specifically as being a source of well-being. That was my second book. And I've now moved on. The image on the left is a picture of the Dirección Municipal de Cultura, the main municipal headquarters for cultural policy development in Granma province in Bartolomé Massó, which is a very small, a big municipality, but a very rural municipality in the foothills of the Sierra Maestra. That is literally the one-story, two-room building from which cultural policy at a local level, at the municipal level, is administered and administrated. So I started to look at how we think about culture when we go outside Havana, when we go outside an urban or capital context, and how culture can have, along with all of the other values I'll list in a second, a developmental value to decolonize a nation, but decolonize minds, and therefore decolonize the nation through a process of deep decolonization. So I'm looking at concepts of center and periphery and how they link into development, and the concept of interculturality. So over the last few years, I've been coming up with a model to try and understand how to do culture in one of these local places is to create an identity that links the local, the provincial, the national, and the global in very, very complex ways, right? National there still very importantly. Just keep an eye on the time. So, as I said, the uses, what are some of the uses and what is the power of culture in Cuba? So, as I've said, it is absolutely central to nation building. Through culture, the Cuban nation can constantly reconstruct what it means to be revolutionary and what it means to be Cuban. And I'd say, obviously, we all use culture to reconstruct what it means to be whatever nationality or wherever we live. It's used as a marker of modernity and development, so it links very closely to international prestige, which is important to identity at any level. It is an instrument for social cohesion because it creates shared narratives, collective spaces, shared discourses, shared practices that bring us together rather than divide us, so to unify people. And that was certainly the experience of the literacy campaign and many other campaigns that have taken place since then. It's a defense against capitalism and neocolonization. It's still to this day. Of course, let's also recognize that culture is also about recreation, about entertainment, about distraction. And since the 1990s and the special period, it's also been a convenient way, the culture industry, we might say, has been a convenient way to nation brand Cuban culture in order to encourage tourism. And that has its own problems. It's been used in an international relations context in terms of cultural diplomacy, in the context of the Cold War, and in the context of the US embargo, which I said has run from 1962 to the present, and has been a mechanism by which Cuba can form alliances with countries, not just the Eastern Bloc, but countries in the global South and countries with left-wing governments who would like to have a productive relationship with Cuba. And of course, in terms of individual and collective identities, what it means to be Cuban, culture is the way by which Cubans develop critique and critical engagement. And these are seen as their revolutionary position and their revolutionary duty. So culture is the way it offers something that political discourse can't, and it's often been used within the system, but to critique and to find mechanisms to improve the system. And that's really, really crucial. So Cuba in the 21st century. Cuba in the 21st century, as I said at the beginning, has been through so many changes. that it's a miracle that it's still surviving in some shape or form. It's had those changes of national leadership, which means that that historic generation that had brought about this historic revolution is no longer there in positions of national leadership by and large. So it has a much younger leader who doesn't have that, it's not charisma, but doesn't have the political authority of having said, I fought a revolution for all of you. He has many other credentials, however, but he doesn't have that status. The changes of the US administration have had a massive impact on the embargo, and I'm going to look at that in a second. So just a simple change from Obama to Trump has had huge and very negative implications for Cuba and for Cuban culture. There has been generational change. There are now generations who clearly don't remember Cuba before 1959, and many Cubans have passed away who did remember Cuba before 1959 and shared those stories with people in their communities. So the disappearance of the historic generation, whether that's political leaders or people on the ground, has been hugely important in terms of generational change. The international context, the geopolitical context around Cuba has also been really volatile, not just what's been happening in the ALBA countries, but also what's happened obviously in the US, in Russia, in China, in the EU, all of those creating quite unstable conditions for Cuba to have a sustained international relations engagement. There's been climate change. So obviously, we suffer the effects. Cuba suffers them much more in terms of hurricanes, more frequent storms, which can have devastating effects. Increased access to new technologies, increased access to social media, we could talk about in the question and answer session. So as a result of the pandemic, especially, Cuba's and Cubans' access to social media and to Wi-Fi has been accelerated. And that has, of course, very positive benefits and very positive effects, but it also has some quite new and unexpected ones, and also some quite negative ones. As a result of the pandemic, as a result of these changes in terms of geopolitical contexts, there have been huge fluctuations in tourism. And obviously the pandemic has made a massive impact on that too. And as if that weren't enough, in January 2021, the dual currency that had existed since a special period was reordered to create a single currency, which has created huge inflation. So there are currently food shortages to do with the pandemic, to do with the embargo, to do with the single currency. There's a black market and there's huge inflation. What you can see on the left are sort of civil police who are trying to order people who are standing in queues waiting for food. Those people are called coleros. They are self-employed and they buy food, they queue all day long, they buy food, and then they sell it on, sometimes at very, very inflated prices. Okay, so you can see that quite a, I would never say it was a stable system, but quite an ordered system of providing for the whole population has become marketized and informalized in a very unhelpful way, and especially during the pandemic. There's been huge debates and huge controversies about the morality of these things happening and the Cuban nation. Okay, so a couple of moments that I want to just stop on in terms of the importance of culture for the US administrations. So some of you may have seen these, those of you who watch Cuba closely may, or who just like culture of this kind, let's just say, I'm not going to characterize it, might have seen things happen in terms of cultural life when Raul Castro and Barack Obama developed that political rapprochement and economic rapprochement during Obama's administration. So on the left, and you might remember that Michelle and Barack Obama traveled to Cuba, but on the left, just before Obama traveled to Cuba, and when he was there, sorry, that's the cat, he staged, or his people staged for them a phone conversation on one of Cuba's most popular comedy series, a weekly series. It's a kind of like a telenovela. It's like a soap opera, but a comedy soap opera about daily life in Cuba called Pánfilo Vivir del Cuento. And it is probably the most popular comedy program on Cuban television, mass audiences. And Obama's people staged a conversation whereby Obama phoned Pamphilo, who's a protagonist, from the White House. Pamphilo picks up the phone and Obama speaks in Cuban slang, "Que bola, what's up, mate? What's going on?" Right? And that was repeated when Obama was in Cuba. So using popular culture, using mass culture to try and, we might say, give a particular image. Let's not go as far as saying image washing, but we might want to give a particular image of the US administration and its feelings about Cuba. At the same time, in the same year, the third image along, Chanel organized a catwalk in the center of Havana on the Prado. You can see to the left the cars that were suddenly refurbished in order to allow people who came for such events, international events, to enjoy the Malecon, the strip of the promenade by the sea in Havana, and to enjoy tours around Havana. And then on the right, Fast and Furious 8 was filmed in Havana that same year. So it was a year where culture, international culture, and what we might consider sort of be the mainstream or bestseller or commercial hits really made a difference to how culture was perceived in Cuba. That wasn't all, of course. The embassies in Havana and Washington were opened, and there were relaxed conditions for the US citizens to travel to Cuba, as long as they went with under educational purposes. And that's what all of those cars were about. So if you traveled to Cuba at that time, or if you traveled to Havana, you'd see an awful lot of cars with a lot of young Americans enjoying tropical Havana. As a result of this rapprochement, many Cuban institutions saw an opening which they really, really have desired. The US is a very close neighbor, and many Cubans now live in the US. So many Cuban institutions sought to establish collaboration with US colleagues. And the Cuban administration, the Cuban government, sought to develop possibilities for trade agreements with the US, the nearest trading neighbor. And then it all screeches to a halt. So if you can just think back to the expectations that were created by that moment of the Obama government, where it seemed that conditions might be normalized, that relationship might be normalized, and that Cuba could have a much freer relationship with the world's remaining superpower. And then this happens. There's Trump signing the kind of heightened embargo and the intensification of the sanctions, and especially in the last few months of his power. I mean, you can look up all of the details in terms of what exactly he signed and what were the added sanctions and what were the blacklists that were created, but they were incredibly restrictive. US tourism was banned, so this is just before the pandemic hits. He put, one of his last acts was to put Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism. Again, you know, a real negative in terms of other countries trading or having a positive relationship with Cuba. Those two embassies that had been opened under Obama were closed. The reason, we might say the excuse, was acoustic damage, such known as Havana syndrome. There are people at Dalhousie University who've worked extensively about what exactly that was about. But it certainly wasn't as nefarious as they might like us to believe. And probably most importantly, at a grassroots level, remittances were severely restricted, and it still remains from the UK very, very difficult. Please ask me to tell you how difficult it is in the questions to send money to Cubans. Very difficult indeed. So the door was shut, the door was slammed shut, and the sanctions were increased. And so as we come to 2021 and 2022, you know, in our own context, whether it's to do with Black Lives Matters, taking the knee, or the statues being removed, whatever it is, we talk increasingly about culture wars and who controls the narratives of history and who controls the narratives of ideology. And for me, in my own work and in my own experience and understanding of Cuba, this is the first time that I've observed the impact of the US embargo via culture so clearly. Culture has become one of the primary mechanisms through which to enact the embargo and other restrictions against Cuba. And I've given you two examples here. You can, if you want to, go watch them on YouTube. So in February 17, 2021, Cuban reggaeton musicians who no longer live in Cuba, they're now based in Florida, created a song called Patria y Vida, February 2021. So a year into the pandemic for us, a little bit less for Cubans because their first wave hit a little bit later, but in plena pandemia, right in the middle of the pandemic, a song whose lyrics, and I'm not going to reproduce them here, are all about the Cuban government's acts of genocide against the Cuban people. A very inflammatory song, which upset an awful lot of Cubans and upset people in other places who are broadly sympathetic to the Cuban Revolution, partly because of the insensitivity of doing it at this time, right in the middle of the pandemic, and with the full knowledge that Cuban doctors and the internationalist campaign of Cuban doctors is saving lives around the world. So a very kind of pointed, intentional attempt to undermine the Cuban Revolution and its approach to human life. So it was premiered on February 17th, and you can see how many views it's had. I would recommend that if you read it on YouTube, you don't read the comments. Sorry, if you watch it on YouTube, you don't read the comments. I tell all of my students, don't read the comments. They're just very, very vicious. As a result of that, 2 weeks later, March the 1st, Cuban musicians create their response to Patria y Vida. Patria y Vida, which means homeland and life. So their response is called Patria o Muerte, which is the slogan often pronounced by Fidel Castro at the end of his speeches, Patria o Muerte, venceremos, but it's called Patria o Muerte por la Vida. Just take a look at the number of views, right? A 10th, and that's being generous, okay? So Cuban musicians from the island who organize a very fast response to Patria y Vida. And what's been happening as part of these culture wars, and is more obvious than ever, I think now, is that what we're hearing are those 10 times the loudest voices on social media and other platforms. They are drowning out voices from the island. So if you go onto Facebook and you look up Ministry of Culture or Ministry of Education, their Facebook presence is completely dominated by bots or real people who are undermining the posts that are put up there constantly. Social media, which, if you'll remember, is much more important now in the lives of Cubans as a result of the pandemic, especially young Cubans. So its impact is being felt more than ever. As a result of that, and I know this because I've been trying to continue projects with colleagues in Cuba at all levels, the Cuban system, including the cultural system, is constantly in defensive and reactive mode. It does not have the headspace, we might say, in order to plan and develop its policy. It's constantly reacting to actions from the outside. So all of those other functions and uses of culture, social cohesion, participation, egalitarianism, well-being, are temporarily suspended whilst everybody's resources are diverted to self-defense. They're repurposed in a very kind of militant way, or they are diminished in importance while greater priorities are attended to. And as I've said, because of social media, because of generational change, what's happening, especially amongst young people in Cuba, is an internalization of the loudest voices from the outside. And, you know, this is no surprise to us. This happens in our own country when we hear news, especially news on social media. We are prone to internalizing all kinds of myths and legends about what's really happening. And for young people who are under huge pressure because of these many crises that are happening in Cuba after their expectations were raised by the Obama administration, this is a very difficult time. There has been, if we look back, a tradition of culture wars in Cuba since 1959. The term culture wars was, I learned a few days ago, developed by an American sociologist in 1991. But we can say that before 59, but certainly from 59 onwards, the US administration has used culture as one of its main instruments. They will call it soft power. We can call it what we want. So Radio Martí from 1985, which then became Radio y Televisión Martí, taking the name of José Martí, the patriot, which is run by the US Agency for Global Media, which calls itself an independent cultural diplomacy agency. And I remember listening to once the equivalent of ambassador of the US Embassy in Cuba, in Havana, Vicky Huddleston, who was a principal officer of the US Interest Section in Havana. You can see that at the building in the image from 1992 to 2002. I remember her giving a speech at a conference in New York where she talked with great pride about how they were importing transistor radios into Havana so that they could listen to Radio Martí. So the most basic campaigns and policies, but a consistent use of culture. So there's a US interest section, and for a long time, and to some extent to this day, there was a digital strip across the top which sent out messages to the Cuban people to abandon the revolution, kind of an LED slogans at the top. And then we could see under Fidel Castro, they decided, right, we're going to plant some flagpoles right in front of it and put the Cuban flag and other flags to hide those messages. So culture and symbols and metaphors have been at the heart of this culture war since 1959. But let's not forget that the Cuban public has for long had access to US TV and radio broadcasts, sometimes legally through strange third-party agreements, sometimes illegally just through nicking the waves, the broadcast waves. So who controls the uses of culture? So the US administration at various points has called it soft power. But since 2008, and this is a really fascinating website, which you've got the link at the bottom there, a fascinating website which charts the design and development of campaigns by a company which was established in Costa Rica and is part of the US administration, called Creative Associates. And, you know, I can read the quote, you can read it yourselves. This innovative sector seeks to counter apathy and stimulate civic engagement by supporting media projects that communicate positive, unbiased messages through different aspects of everyday life and humor. So this is a thing, it's called USAID, and since 2008 to 2012, predominantly, Tracy Eaton has followed the kinds of campaigns that have been funded in order to create this unbiased message, in quotes. You can see promoting alternative media channels for youth, stirring Afro-Cuban communities into action, supporting civil society networking, etc., etc. And youth comes out, youth and Afro-Cuban communities come out very, very strongly here. So this is a deliberate agency of the US government, which is completely geared towards cultural actions. So the uses of culture in contemporary Cuba. It's more complex than ever. All of those uses that I outlined at the beginning and halfway through, all those socio-cultural, socio-political uses that culture has had, still remain and are being developed. But at moments of siege and crises, these uses play out not only in national context, but also relationally and internationally. And it's not just about the USSR, predominantly in the last few years in relation to US actions. So this is where I'm starting to say we need to put another actor into our very complex picture of how Cuban culture works. So under US aggression, Cuban state institutions incorporate more explicitly political narratives, spaces, metaphors, and symbols than they would were that aggression not to exist. And I'm not saying it's a wrong thing, I'm just saying it's a reaction. And Cuban culture enters a more reactive, defensive mode, which also has implications for the infrastructure and the development of a sustained and responsive domestic cultural policy. So it's constantly being interfered with and disrupted. Here are, nowadays, some of the complex uses of culture in contemporary Cuba. So on the left, and I really do urge you, if you're going to do anything on YouTube to do with Cuba, to look up, I'll put it in the chat afterwards, a series of videos about a little Cuban boy called Chamakili. And Chamakili has become the representative of how children should do their best to keep their spirits up during the pandemic. They are absolutely charming videos, absolutely beautiful videos that are there to provide a sense of well-being to small children in the strangeness that is this pandemic. We can see local cultural activities. We can see on the bottom left, the Havana Book Festival, which is a national festival and an international festival with Mexico as its invited guest, is going to take place. To the right of that is one of the exhibits from the Biennale, from the Bienal de La Habana. We can see the predominance of mobile phones. They're now, you know, people walk down the streets bumping into lampposts just like we do. It's all the same in Cuba these days, especially in the cities. There's a McDonald's, that's in Guantanamo. That's the only place you're going to find the Golden Arches in Cuba for now. And then you can see I've tried to get an image with the cables that cross the streets in some of the older towns and cities of Cuba, and the fact that many of those cables then bring illegally television and cable channels from the US into Cuban homes. You can see local libraries, And you can see, of course, Pamphilo, the most popular comedy program. So that diversity and that complexity is still there. What I'm trying to develop, and I'm coming to an end now, is a more complex approach to Cuban cultural studies. Not just one, and this is really the picture in, slightly reduced terms, but this is really the picture that comes out of a lot of Cuban cultural studies off the island. So not just an approach that recognizes intentional political and ideological intervention in culture when it comes from the USSR or left-wing Latin America. That's the usual focus. Not just one that sees cultural resistance as resistance to socialist and communist models. Again, that's one of the main areas of focus. Not one that sees US influence in Cuban culture as benign or inevitable. So it's not just about the 1950s cars and the Tropicana Club and the fact that Errol Flynn was in Cuba in the 1950s. There is a much less benign influence that's been there since the beginning of the 20th century. So not just one that sees the US influence only in terms of a vestige of pre-59 cultural life, a kind of nostalgia, but as a living phenomenon. And one that sees interculturality and relationality in multiple ways that connect all of these different levels of being Cuban, local, regional, national, and local, within a very complex and constantly changing geopolitical map, which comprises different cultural practices that are defined by relations of power. And that's the important thing. These are not all on the same level. On that note, and the timing's not been bad either, I will stop sharing and over to you for questions.
Well, thank you very much for that, Pa. That was really impressive stuff. It's, a breath of fresh air to see, such a presentation guided by what's actually going on and influenced in such a way. So really, thank you. It's a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it and a very insightful. So we're going to move on to questions now. People can ask